If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary also get this episode ad-free with bonus content and early access. In the main episode, Asher Lowy referenced a disturbing case in Passaic involving a man charged with sexually abusing 3 children and the community response that followed. For our paid subscribers, I asked Asher to go much deeper into that case. We talk about what happened in the courtroom, why prosecutors were alarmed by the level of communal support for the accused, and what it means when families openly discuss pressuring victims into silence. We also explore why cases like this almost never reach prosecutors in Orthodox communities, and what that says about who feels protected and who does not. If you want to better understand how these patterns repeat themselves and why they matter far beyond any single case, that bonus conversation is available now for paid subscribers. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. I also want to tell you about the latest episode of Intimate Judaism, the podcast I co-host with Tali Rosenbaum. Our newest episode is entitled Just Be Normal, Navigating Conflicts Between Desire, Intimacy, Identity, and Jewish Law, an Intimate Judaism Q&A. We answer real, honest questions people submitted about desire, restraint, emotional health, boundaries, and intimacy within Jewish life. We talk about challenges within marriage, questions of attraction, postpartum struggles, Shmirat Einayim, and how to approach sensitive issues without shame while staying firmly rooted in Jewish law. If you've ever felt torn between emotional reality and religious commitment, this episode will really speak to you. You can find Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, or just click on the link in the show notes. Now, let's begin today's episode of the Orthodox Conundrum podcast, entitled When We Get It Wrong, Orthodox Communities and the Nechemya Weberman Case. This episode of the Orthodox Conundrum includes discussion of sexual abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
There's no reason to consider that he's been rehabilitated when it is patently obvious, because he's saying it, that he has no interest in being rehabilitated because he doesn't believe he's done anything wrong. So, and that isn't just a matter of like, oh, I'm just saying it for the courts. This is the behavior and the pattern of somebody who has convinced themselves and deeply believes that they have not done that they're fine. They're fine. They don't have to fix anything. He believes that this was a tremendous injustice that was done to him. Obviously, he knows what he did, but he has justified and you know, in whatever ways that he's done that. But he's not looking to be rehabilitated. He's not looking to change this. And the environment around him, the community, as we've talked about, is not calling him to account in any way, shape, or form. Nobody's holding him responsible. So he's not holding himself responsible. Nobody outside of him is holding him responsible. There's no reason to even think or consider that he's been rehabilitated.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. This episode of the Orthodox Conundrum addresses a very painful and unsettling subject. Last week we learned that Nechemya Weberman, who was convicted of repeatedly sexually assaulting a minor, has had his prison sentence dramatically reduced. Although Weberman originally received the sentence of more than 100 years, that sentence has now been cut to 18 years, making him eligible for release in about 2 years. For many people, this was shocking, and for others, it was more of a confirmation of something they had feared for a long time. Because this is not only a legal story, but also a communal one. It forces us to ask not only what the court decided, but what happens when justice intersects with communal loyalty, religious authority, and the instinct to protect our own. This conversation is not about whether a crime occurred. That question was answered years ago in a court of law. The deeper question is what happens afterward. How communities respond, whose voices are believed, and whose pain is ignored or exacerbated, sometimes consciously and openly, so that communal stability can be preserved. To explore these questions, I'm joined by three people who bring deeply informed and very different perspectives. Asher Lowy of Zaka has followed the Weberman case for more than a decade and understands its history and its communal aftermath in ways few others do. Serena Townsend is the attorney who represented the victim and worked to oppose the reduction of Weberman's sentence. And Shana Aronson, the head of Magen in Israel, brings the essential perspective of victim safety, trauma, and what these legal decisions mean for survivors long after court proceedings end. Together, we discuss how and why the sentence was reduced, what remorse and rehabilitation are supposed to mean, and why, in this case, those concepts ring hollow for so many. But we also confront something even more uncomfortable. What does it say about a religious community when protection is extended more readily to perpetrators than to victims? And what happens when our drive to preserve our institutions and community structures leads us to abandon our moral compass? This is not an easy conversation, but it's one we cannot afford to avoid, and we'll get to it in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Asher Lowy is the director of Zaka, a nonprofit that advocates for survivors of sexual violence in the Jewish community through awareness, education, and direct support. As a survivor himself, Asher brings both lived experience and organizational leadership to his work, partnering with community and national organizations to expand access to mental health resources, legal support, and survivor-centered programming. He is passionate about creating safer and more accountable Jewish communities and empowering survivors to be heard. Serena Townsend is the founding partner of criminal defense and litigation firm Townsend Law, PLLC. In this capacity, Ms. Townsend represents individuals charged with crimes, law enforcement personnel facing disciplinary charges, and is also a victim advocate. She was awarded the 2025 Distinguished Leader Award by the New York Law Journal. She has represented survivors of powerful sexual abusers like Harvey Weinstein. From 2016 to 2022, Ms. Townsend was the Deputy Commissioner of the Investigation and Trials Divisions at the New York City Department of Correction. Before that, she was a Deputy Bureau Chief at the Kings County District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, New York. Over the course of her 10 years there, Ms. Townsend prosecuted high-profile, complex cases. She specialized in sex crimes prosecutions, but achieved top-count convictions in all areas of criminal prosecution. She is a frequent legal commentator for Law and Crime and has been profiled, featured in, or quoted on all news mediums nationally and internationally, including on Dateline, NBC News, BBC, CNN, the New York Times, the London Times, and many more. Shana Aronson holds a BS in psychology and certification in educational guidance counseling, training in abuse prevention with at-risk children and youth, and IFS therapy. Shana's past work experience includes mentoring at-risk youth through several educational programs. She then served as the assistant director of Sophia, a residential therapeutic home for adolescent girls at risk, where she supervised staff and co-facilitated DBT group sessions for clients and coordinated the administrative needs of the organization. She later worked as the social services coordinator for Magen Child Protective Services, where she supported families whose children had been physically and sexually abused, before joining Jewish Community Watch as a case manager, and finally as the executive director of Magen. Outside of her work running Magen, Shana's advocacy roles include volunteering as a coach to religious brides who are survivors of interpersonal trauma, and birth assistant to women with histories of sexual and physical abuse. Serena Townsend, Asher Lowy, and Shana Aronson, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast. We're going to be speaking about a very difficult subject, the recent news that Nechemya Weberman has been granted an early release from jail. Before we get into that, which is going to be our main topic, Asher, I'd like you to briefly summarize what Nechemya Weberman did, who came forward, and what the verdict was initially.
So Weberman was operating as an unlicensed therapist in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, counseling girls, teens, even married women He was doing this all without a license as a part of the Varatsnias, which was sort of like a group put together of Hasidic men in the community whose job it was to make sure that everybody was following the laws of Tznius. And he was sent his victim basically by an ultimatum from the school on the Varatsnias. Essentially, they didn't like some of the things that she was doing in school. Nothing crazy, right? She was dressing a little bit in a way that they didn't like, which relative to most of your audience would probably be like stricter standards than they have, her immodesty in these schools, right? And asking some questions that they didn't appreciate, Amuna related things and the like. And they told her, you have a choice. We'll either expel you from the yeshiva system, from the entire UTA system, and the yeshiva you're in now, which would have ruined her future in the community, or you can go to Weberman for counseling. So, her family opted to send her to Weberman, and they paid a lot of money to Weberman over the course of that treatment over the next 3 years. Now, instead of treating her and giving
I
her
need to interrupt. I'm sorry. What kind of therapist was he? When you say treat her, what was he ostensibly doing? I know he wasn't licensed, but they assumed they would get some sort of service. What was he?
He wasn't a licensed or trained counselor of any kind. He was just a guy who hung a shingle, and there's no question in my mind that he positioned himself that way to specifically be able to prey on the young girls and women who came to him. And he was from a very prominent family. I don't want to derail this podcast by getting into why he's such a prominent member of Satmar, but he really could have had any job he wanted, and that's the job he chose. But he was in no way qualified to provide any counseling, and he had this vague title that he would use as a rabbinic counselor, therapist, something like that. But the bottom line was he would have girls sent to him, girls, teens, married women sent to him for counseling by the Varatsnias. And his victim was sent to him by the Varatsnias with this ultimatum. And she saw him for 3 years. And according to her testimony at the trial, from the second she walked into his office the first day until the last time she saw him, he raped her and sexually assaulted her at every single one of those encounters. Not only that, but when she took a brief break for a couple of weeks, not going to him because all of this was getting to be too much for her, he went and visited her at her house and raped her in her own bed. Okay. She eventually, left the school. The school expelled her because the therapy wasn't working. Go figure. And she eventually wound up at a different school completely that had a social worker there who was licensed. And she disclosed to that social worker, who subsequently called it into authorities. Weberman was arrested. And the community's response to his arrest was to hold a public fundraiser for him at a wedding hall. Not only that, it wasn't just that they held a fundraiser. Scott, they advertised this for weeks in advance. They called the campaign to advertise his Pidyon Shvilim fund, Alilas 75, right? Alila obviously referring to blood libel, and 75 being the number of years he was facing based on the charges that were leveled against him. And I remember seeing the posters up in Borough Park. I was living in and working in Borough Park at the time, and I remember vividly seeing the posters up. And over the course of that public fundraiser, as well as the fundraising that happened before, the community raised about $500,000 for him, which was subsequently used to try to bribe the victim and her husband to drop the case and go to Israel. The two of them, the victim and her husband, faced severe backlash from the community. She was publicly thrown out of shul on Rosh Hashanah when she went to hear Shofar. Her husband's business was closed down because the hechsher was pulled for no reason other than the fact that
this is the victim's parents
against Weberman. The victim's husband lost his business. The victim's father also lost his business. There was a competing business that was opened by Satmar, specifically at the orders of the Satmar Rebbe in Williamsburg, to shut him down, to punish him because of what his daughter did in terms of Mesira, right? And her husband was physically assaulted in the street. The two of them faced death threats. The Satmar Rebbe of Kiryas Yael publicly called her a whore. And throughout the trial, there were many attempts to intimidate her. There were people arrested from inside the courtroom for taking pictures and uploading it to Twitter to try to identify her because she was a Jane Doe. And ultimately, the verdict was guilty by a unanimous vote from a jury, and he was ultimately sentenced to 103 years in prison by the judge.
Okay, just two quick questions to clarify. You say the victim's husband, so how long after the events did the trial take place? Because I realize that people in the Satmar community do get married younger than those probably in the wider Jewish community. But how old was she when this took place?
So she was 12 at the time the abuse started, and it continued until she was about 15 or 16. And by the time the trial happened, it was about a year and a half or so later. Her and her now husband were engaged, so he was her fiance at the time.
Okay. And my final question is this. I realize this hasn't been determined by a court of law, but as best as we know, were there other victims as well of Weberman?
So there was an affidavit filed by one of the prosecutors on the case from the DA's office saying that she had received complaints from at least 6 other victims who were minors at the time of the abuse, ranging up to women who were married at the time of the alleged abuse. And she filed this along with, as an affidavit along with the different filings. So that's some information that we have about additional victims. There were also additional victims that the victim herself, in this case, alleged had contacted her and disclosed abuse that Weberman had committed against her. There were some other victims that were discussed in the course of the trial, that were discussed during motion practice. And there were other people outside of the trial that identified themselves as victims of Weberman that were unconnected to all of these people, right? There was one specific person who, a guy who's no longer alive, he went by Joey D'Angelo. He grew up in Satmar. And he was one of the early pioneering, I guess you want to call it, OTDers, who was public about having been sexually abused. And he actually confronted Weberman in the hallway one of the days of the trial. There's this iconic photo that was taken by a reporter of the two of them staring each other down. And he alleged that Weberman had sexually abused him when he was a boy. Joey is no longer alive. He died by suicide or overdose. So it, there's good indication, as you said, it hasn't been proven in court, but there's good indication that Weberman had many, many more victims. There was also a civil case that was filed by the victim in this case that resulted in a multi-million-dollar payout by UTA, which is the Satmar umbrella organization. And there were affidavits filed in that case that indicated that UTA had known that Weberman was a problem in terms of sexual abuse in the 90s already. So this seems to have been a long-running problem.
And his sentence of 103 years was for this one victim alone, however.
Correct. She was the only one who came forward and, braved the inevitable backlash. I completely understand why the other victims didn't come forward. And in discussing this in the 13 years since, there's been discussion about why none of them ever came forward. And it's my understanding that, despite no apparent lack of victims, they were all very happy that this victim stood for them. And they were happy to see that Weberman was convicted and sentenced. And they assumed that would last, right? So they didn't feel a need to put themselves through what she had gone through. They were happy that she had spared them the trouble.
Okay, thank you, Asher. Serena, you were the defense attorney for the victim. Can you tell us what exactly the judge decided this week regarding Weberman's sentence? And I know that it's eligible for release in 5 years. I'd like to understand practically what does that mean in our existing legal context?
Sure. So just to clarify, I was actually not involved in the original case, in the original trial. Interestingly enough, that's because I was a prosecutor at the Brooklyn DA's office at that exact time. Back in 2013, I wasn't working on this case in particular, but I was not only working at the office, but in the bureau that prosecuted this case. So I know this case. I knew the background behind it back when I was, a young prosecutor. I've had 2 different careers since then. But now, which is very, very rare for a victim to have to hire an attorney to advocate for her, because even though victim is not a client of a DA's office, the DA's office is supposed to take into account and consideration how a victim feels about sentencing. So I was retained just this year, or last year, I guess we're in January now, to help the victim in this case advocate to keep him behind bars. To answer your question, so he was originally sentenced to 103 years. That was commuted down to 50 just by virtue of the law, technicalities and whatnot. It had to go down to 50. There was no argument about that. However, subsequent to that, Weberman appealed, even that sentence, saying it was cruel and unusual. And he asked essentially for a time served. We could talk all about that process, but to answer your question, at this point, he's been sentenced now to 18 years, 5 more years than what he is currently served. But, as you kind of alluded to, with good behavior, that could pretty much amount to another 2.5 years.
Now, Serena, how common is it for a perpetrator like Weberman to have his sentence reduced like this? Is that a very common thing?
It is not. It is not common. What I'll say is it's also not common to be sentenced to 103 years. But what we like to say in our field is the best person to make the judgment on what an appropriate sentence is the judge, it's the trial judge. It's the judge who sat through the trial, who heard the testimony, who was there. There's something very significant about that person being the one to determine somebody's sentence.
So the fact that it was originally commuted or reduced, I suppose is the better term, from 103 to 50 years or so. Now, you said that 103 is a lot. Is 50 more typical? Is 18 more typical now that it is 18? Like, what are the numbers? Because I'm just not familiar.
So as a lawyer's favorite phrase, it depends. The sentencing depends on a ton of things. There's aggravating factors, there's mitigating factors. This particular case was charged in such a way where he could have been exposed to a lot of years. It was done, in my opinion, for a good reason, and that is because it reflected not only the multiple incidents, but yeah, I do think that the DA's office was trying to represent as many victims as possible without having to put them on the stand. Legally, obviously that goes towards his defense attorney's argument to lower it. But at the same time, it's important for your listeners to understand that although you can be charged for only one person, when it comes to sentencing, a judge is actually allowed to take into account other aggravating factors, including whether they believe there might have been other victims.
Oh, that's very interesting. I didn't realize that was legally true.
I know, and that is rare. But my point is, the reason the sentence was so rare and so high for a one victim case is presumably because the judge did see, that affidavit, did hear information that other victims existed. And although it seems kind of incongruous to the law, that usually the sentence has to fit the exact crime and convictions. There are, like I said, even for mitigating factors, a judge could take into consideration somebody's prior good behavior or community support, stuff like that. It's in the same vein. So you can take that into account.
But Serena, isn't it also not just one victim, but multiple counts of rape and abuse?
It is. It's multiple. It's a course of conduct. And that is why it was charged that way. And I assume that's why a judge sentenced it that way. And just as an aside, is it a typical number? Again, it depends. There have definitely been other cases, and his defense attorney cited those cases where people have done similar acts and have not been convicted, sentenced to that high of a number. However, again, this situation was so horrific because it wasn't just Weberman, it was almost an indictment of the community as well. Typically, when we see as attorneys, when we go to the courtroom and people argue on behalf of their client that they should have a lesser sentence because they have community support, this is the exact opposite. It's the only case really that I could ever think of in my 20-year career where the community is actually a barrier to rehabilitation rather than, a mitigating factor where somebody could argue it supports rehabilitation.
Well, let me ask you on that particular point. Is it really fair, however, to give Weberman the sentence because of the poor activity and the poor actions, deplorable actions of his community? It almost sounds like you're punishing him for something that they did. I realize he's guilty. I'm not trying to claim otherwise, but in saying what you said, you're implying that they increase the sentence partially because he comes from a community that deserves to be punished.
No, it increases the sentence because his rehabilitation is less likely because of the community he's going to return to.
Got it. Okay. Then in that case, Serena, I'll stick with you for another moment. In terms of reducing the sentence, at least from the judge's perspective, what is the reason that it was reduced so significantly to the point he might get out in a couple of years?
So the defense made, specific arguments that for example, the case sentence is not aligned with other cases that are similar. They made arguments about his health deteriorating, things of that nature. And I think that it's a mistake to trust those arguments. First of all, even as we saw him the other day on the screen, his health is absolutely not deteriorating at all. He's in perfectly good health. He looked completely fine. And if you want to compare that to other cases, I mean, just look at Harvey Weinstein, who's definitely dying in jail and is not being released. So that, unfortunately or fortunately, our judicial system simply doesn't release people who are just old and have like regular old people problems. They release people who are basically on their deathbeds, which he was clearly not. Other cases that, were similarly situated according to the defense, but given lesser sentences, again, I don't believe took into account these other added aggravating factors of other victims existing. There's the cases that we cited. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the point is other cases that they cited in their own support, there was maybe one act or even multiple acts, but there was no sign that there were other victims.
Okay, thank you, Serena. I want to jump over to Shauna now. There's more to discuss from a legal angle, but I first want to talk about that community angle, the fact that the community could be a barrier to his rehabilitation. So talking about this concept, Shauna, of a tight-knit religious community, does early release eligibility, or in practice, the early release of a perpetrator, how does that affect a victim's sense of safety, particularly when that victim is a member of a tight-knit religious community?
Well, I think it obviously sends a very clear message to both the victim in the case, as well as any other victims of this perpetrator that may be out there, as well as victims in general, that they are not safe. Unfortunately, there's no question that it sends a very clear message, meaning especially when we're not just having him, he's not just being released. Basically, as Serena was saying, the community is saying, we don't actually believe that he's guilty. Doesn't matter if the court has said he's guilty. It doesn't matter if at this point he's even stood up in court and said that he's guilty. We don't believe he's guilty, which means we're going to give him access to anything and anyone that he wants. He's going to go back to whatever position that he wants. Nobody's going to be taking any steps to keep him away from vulnerable people in any way, shape, or form. Why should they? They're claiming he's innocent. Not only is he innocent, but he has suffered this horrible injustice by being held in jail for something that he didn't do. So I think that the message is very clear, like I said, to both the victims of the individual as well as any other victims who are following this, which many do, that they are not safe and that their safety is absolutely not a priority.
And Shauna, what have you seen in terms of this idea of re-traumatization, not from the crime itself, but from the reaction of community members? What you just said, as she's the one who is lying, as Asher described earlier, her being chased out of shul. She's the one who took an innocent man and threw him into jail. What is that experience like for a victim?
Well, I mean, first of all, I do have to say that this case was one of the most, had some of the most severe pushback that I think most of us have ever heard of. And I've obviously been involved in a lot of cases with a lot of really horrible things that have happened. But sort of if you put all together all these different stories, it's almost taken on to the point of almost like mythical proportions, the amount of hell that they heaped on this woman. Of just, I mean, everything, every kind of crazy story that we hear of. They weren't counted in a minyan and they were thrown out of shul or their businesses were shut down. She and her husband went through every single one of those things. So I think that there is, but even if you don't go to this extreme, to this particular case where all of these things were experienced, where it was so loud and so public and so disgusting, I think that I've seen that anytime there's a case where the community comes out in support of the abuser, even if it's not quite this in your face, even when it's more subtle, there's an absolute, number one, as you said, re-traumatization for victims. I have spoken to victims who, like I said, were not even abused by that particular individual or abused by somebody else in that community, and have called me in very poor mental states after hearing or following some kind of story that has gone on where the community has supported somebody who is alleged or convicted of to have molested somebody or somebody's. I mean, there's just, additionally, aside from the re-traumatizing factor and what that does to people emotionally, there's no question that there's a chilling effect for other victims who might have considered pressing charges, who might have considered taking some sort of action, and who start questioning themselves twice, 3 times, 4 times. Do I really want to go through this? Do I really want to let my children go through this? I hear this from parents all the time. I don't want my child has already suffered enough. I don't want them to suffer more by going through the process of the reporting. It absolutely just kind of pulls back all of the any kind of positive energy that certainly anyone in my position or in positions like mine has been trying to, kind of give over to victims, that yes, you do have options, and you can make a choice of taking action, of standing up for, whatever it is that you feel is the right thing to do here, of justice, of healing, of whatever that might be. And it just absolutely has this, just sucks the air right out of all that energy, and really does take us back. No question.
Okay. Asher?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple more things about the community aspect of this and the support that he has from them. So first of all, in addition to everything that Rena said about factors taken into consideration on sentencing, I want to reiterate what Shana said about how the community uniquely tortured this victim. They acted on behalf of Weberman in doing it. There was no question that the community was acting on behalf of Weberman. The judge in the first trial saw that in no small part because 4 people were arrested from inside the courtroom for taking pictures and uploading it to Twitter with her name, right? In fact, we were playing whack-a-mole with at the time. I remember we were playing whack-a-mole with her name on websites, trying to get it taken down. I want to highlight something also, that this is not about the Weberman case, but it's sort of a corollary that highlights the point that Serena made about the community itself, recognizably being a part of the problem. There's a case in Passaic that's ongoing right now, involving a man who's accused of sexually abusing 3 young children, and the prosecutor in that case said something interesting at the hearing where he was detained. He's being held without bail. She said that in 20 years of prosecuting cases in Passaic, she's only had 1 referral from the Orthodox community, and it doesn't make sense to her that the community has so much less sexual abuse than any other. It must mean that there's a reason why the referrals aren't making it to her. And then she said about the courtroom that was packed full of supporters from the community for this guy, right? A mix of people from Spring Valley and Passaic. The fact of the matter here is that because this courtroom is filled, it shows that the community is rallying around the defendant, and it's an example of obstruction. From the minute the defendant hit the jail, the entire community turned on the mother and these victims. Without hearing a single piece of evidence, any statement, any testimony, they stood behind him. The community ties do not offset the danger to the community. In fact, they embolden the defendant. And another thing I want to point out is, in the 13 years since, right, the community, if you want to see where Satmar is on sexual abuse, right, and how all of this is in bad faith, right, aside from the fact that they're calling Weberman Yosef Atzadik in the papers every week, and Weberman's writing op-eds every week, we'll talk about that later, I'm sure. The community itself spent millions, without exaggeration, millions of dollars on Weberman, between the appeals, the defense costs, the political promises made to the DA who's seeking higher office, etc. And all the attendant expenses of busing people up to go visit him and donating to his commissary and all the crap that's been going on since then. Not a single red cent in the entire 13 years since has been spent on helping a single victim in the community. Quite the contrary. That tells me that the community is bent on doing nothing but protecting abusers and continuing to do what they did to this victim if anybody else comes forward about anybody else, or Weberman if he abuses again when he gets out.
Serena, I want to go back to you and ask about the rabbinic letter that was sent to the judge that requested the reduction of Weberman's sentence. Without naming any specific rabbis on the letter, I want to talk about whether that had an effect and your approach towards that, what you thought of that.
So I think character letters will always have some sort of effect in a situation like this. And I do also want to note something that Asher touched on in that last answer, which was the lack of rehabilitation and lack of remorse. So that was actually the third argument that the defense made, that he was remorseful and rehabilitated. And that is obviously not true, because, as Asher mentioned, he spent all of these 13 years denying guilt and appealing the case. So, in that sense, that should have been taken into consideration during this last hearing as well. Now, to answer you, Scott,
well, you know what? Actually, Sarita, let me first get to that point, and we'll come back to the letter afterwards, as long as you mentioned that, just to keep things organized. So I'm confused. He was not really remorseful, and that's easy to verify. We can see it by what Asher said, what he writes. He is actually in perfectly fine health. That's easy to verify. Yeah. So if those are some of the main reasons that the judge decided to reduce his sentence, why do we know this, but the judge apparently didn't care or didn't notice that?
So their brief listed the three major factors. It was the two you just listed, and then they claimed that it was inconsistent with how other cases were sentenced that were in similar situations. My brief that I filed said exactly that. I said they gave three reasons, none of which make sense. Those two were, again, easily verifiable. And then the case law, I cited many cases that actually some people were sentenced to much, much higher sentences than the 13 that he was at this point. So I think that the judge must have relied on that one piece because the other two are completely verifiably false.
Okay. All right. Now let's get back to the letter then. Yes.
Okay. The letter. So that letter, look, I think a lot of it depends on how much a judge cares about keeping people like that happy, keeping those rabbis happy. I think a lot of it, how does the DA care about keeping those rabbis happy? I do think that it shows a huge force behind him. But again, my argument would be the contrary. My argument would be, you see, these rabbis, it's rabbis. These are rabbis. They're not even, family members or regular coworkers who are like, hey, this guy is great. These are people who may not even know him, are in a position where just by the very nature of their title, they are considered holy, right? In certain ways, they're considered morally incorruptible. And so he collects these signatures from these rabbis who have that reputation and present it to a judge, and so the judge might really buy into that. Now, here's the biggest problem of all, and I know Asher's probably chomping at the bit to talk about this, and he should. The issue is we don't know what those rabbis were told. We don't know what they were told. And pursuant to investigations, we found out that at least one of those rabbis, at least one of them, a very well-respected, prominent rabbi, was bamboozled, was basically told none of the details of what actually happened, and was told this guy, Weberman, is being sentenced so aggressively simply because everybody's an anti-Semite, and it's because he's Jewish, it's because he's Satmar, and look how many years he got compared to all these other people, without explaining the real reason why he got all of those years, and that it definitely had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So we don't know what they were told, and I also included that in my brief, including a screenshot and a link to a video that rabbi said retracting his signature from the letter.
Okay, Asher, I'm sure you want to comment on this as well.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say about the rabbis writing letters in general. I know we've done an episode about this. I'm not going to belabor this point much. But when Hershel Schachter signed that letter initially, why didn't he Google? Why didn't he have if he's too old to, why didn't he have somebody else do it? We're supposed to believe in these Rabbanim, these Gedolim, that they're qualified to give psak on literally anything. How am I supposed to believe that this guy's capable of telling me if my soup is kosher after a fly falls into it, if he can't have one of his Gabbaim Google Nechemya Weberman, if he's about to sign an extremely consequential letter? And don't get me wrong, I give him credit for retracting later, right? Because that's something that a lot of Rabbanim don't do. And he's gone further than any of the other ones who have apologized in trying to correct the wrong that he did. And I give him credit for that. But I think it's all too common that Rabbanim do this without thinking, and then they have to fix the problem. I also want to say that as far as the other rabbis go, not Schachter, but as far as the other rabbis go, first of all, a lot of those signatories have covered up a lot of rape of children in their past. I'm thinking specifically of the Skver Rebbe who signed it. He has covered up more sexual abuse than any of us can count, David Torsky. One of the signatories on the letter was the Munkacher Rebbe, who has provided lawyers for so many rapists who are who are facing criminal charges in the community. Another signatory on the letter was the Baba Rebbe, who publicly wrote a letter on behalf of Jacob Daskal, who was the founder of Shomrim, who was convicted of raping a girl who was living in his house, a troubled girl that he took into his house, and he flew to Chicago and raped her over there, right? So he was one of the signatories on the letter. And the Satmar Rebbes were both signatories on this letter, one of whom publicly called the victim a whore back in the day, and the other one put the victim's father out of business. And not only did he call her a whore, the words he used to call her a whore, where he said sarcastically about her, "Hachazayna yia esachosenu," right? The words that were spoken by Shimon and Levi when they avenged Dinah, he spoke those words ironically to call her a whore, right? So that's who's signing this letter, you know? So we don't have to sit around and wonder what the rabbis were thinking. They're disgusting pieces of garbage who support rapists as a matter of course, and they're the reasons why their communities are unsafe.
Let me just mention that, Usher, that episode you're referring to where we talked about the problems with rabbis signing such letters was episode 232 of this podcast, if people want to go back and listen to it. Shauna, let me ask you, in terms of the communal reason that these rabbis feel this need to do so, I don't know if you can answer that question, but why do you think that rabbis who are otherwise respected in their community, and unfortunately even because of this in some places, why do they feel the need to defend people who've done some truly awful sexual crimes?
I think there's a few different answers to that. I mean, first of all, I'll start by saying I don't think I have a good answer. I don't have a good answer to this question. It defies anything you can possibly really like wrap your head around. But I do think that it's probably not the same for all, meaning some, as Usher has just described, are terrible. Certainly with anything relating to this topic, just absolutely terrible. What they believe is terrible. What they think, what they choose to educate themselves about and hear and not educate themselves about is terrible. Everything about it is terrible. So why do they write the letters? I mean, it's consistent with everything else they're doing, which is just awful. As far as, why do we sometimes see rabbis signing letters like this who are people that we do think are a little more perhaps informed or intelligent on this topic? And then it becomes, I think, in some ways, even like many ways, more confusing. Like, well, but okay, we can, if we say these people just have completely toxic beliefs and about everything relating to this, but these people, as far as we can understand, don't. So why? And then I think it becomes, obviously there's a lot of cognitive dissonance and there's a number of different factors. The oldest one in the book is certainly money. If you've got a rabbi who's got a prominent member of his kehillah who donates to the shul and is involved in the shul and contributes to the shul, and then he feels like he's in a sticky situation, so he has to figure out some way to write a letter, and maybe he doesn't quite say that he agrees with what the guy did, but he's got to figure out some, twist himself into a pretzel in order to be able to say something to give this guy the benefit of the doubt so that he can be a character witness for him, or provide this letter in court. And so, yeah, I think sometimes it's about money. And sometimes I do think that it's a little bit more sinister, that there's, if it's somebody in the community, they might know things about others in the community. There's a little bit of a cycle of like a Brit Avaryanim, the trust between thieves or criminals, where I know this about you, you know this about me. We're going to both keep our mouths shut. And so I'm going to have to back you up right now because you know about some sketchy things, even if it's not necessarily on this topic. And we don't want that to get out. So we've all just got to collectively keep our mouths shut or try to protect each other. And I definitely am aware of cases where it's about that. Beyond that, I have no other answers. And not that I think any of these are good answers, but I cannot, it really does defy, I cannot imagine a scenario where somebody would ask me to write a letter for them, which is going to be presented in court or given to a judge or has any bearing on a legal proceeding, where I'm not going, wait, I have about 75 questions that I'm going to need answered first before I agree to sign this letter. Like who, and like Usher said, it very much does beg the question, if these are the people that we are entrusting with so much, we're asking shilas about so many deeply important and integral and central parts of areas of our lives. We're asking shilas about our children's chinuch. We're asking shilas about our relationships with our spouses. We're asking shilas, if these are the people that we're supposed to be trusting to be able to answer these incredibly important questions for us, what does that mean when these same people are doing something which just by all common sense seems idiotic? Like, what does that mean? So yeah, I think, I think sometimes it's sinister reasons, and sometimes I honestly don't know.
I would like to add to that, and I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I think there's often a persecution complex among certain sectors of the Orthodox community, maybe born of being persecuted for close to 2,000 years in the countries in which they were residing. And there, if you were arrested by the government, it was probably on a false charge. And even though in a place like the United States or Israel, that is patently not true. It doesn't mean that things can't go wrong, but by and large, the courts are fair. And by and large, if somebody is arrested for child abuse and is convicted, chances are it's actually very, very much true. They still might have this mentality of, oh, it's the goyim, oh, it's the outside world, and just discounting them. This persecution complex, I think, continues in many different arenas. That's what I would add to that conversation.
Yes. I certainly, I know that I talk about this a lot when we talk about the issue of Masira, and where Masira is still thought, kind of considered an issue or a factor when making decisions about reporting.
Let me just explain that Masira means giving someone over to the secular authorities.
Yes. And absolutely, so much of that comes down to a persecution complex. And how do you convince otherwise intelligent people who do care about their children? I do believe that the majority of people in this community do care about their kids. So how do you convince someone that they shouldn't go to the police or shouldn't go to social services when their child is in danger, and that is the address of who they're supposed to go to keep them safe? The answer is when you've managed to really raise somebody with a really deeply ingrained persecution complex, where they have been raised on the stories of how their grandparents and their great grandparents were thrown in jail for no reason, were tortured, were sent to the gulag, into Siberia, and to God knows where, and that's very much a part of your just generational history and who you are. Yeah, it's not such a far jump to say that but it's not gonna be that hard to convince people, don't trust the police. They're all out to get you. Everybody's lying. And of course, it's not true.
So on the one hand, the persecution complex thing is very real and very present. I think it's employed cynically by the leaders of the community. In other words, the people at the bottom, the everyday people,
yes.
Believe it very strongly. But the people weaponizing it are entirely cynical about it. They know it's nonsense, and they weaponize it because they know that the hoi polloi, feels very strongly about it. But another thing, that doesn't explain the whole story. The fact of the matter is, there's a lot of ignorance in the community about this, because the frum media resolutely refuses to cover this topic, right? And we resolutely refuse to allow people to talk about it in public. People have censored internet, right? The Rabbanim don't allow this to be taught in school. We don't teach abuse prevention. We don't do any of this stuff. So in the secular world, you get a lot of information about sexual violence by osmosis. You see it in the news. You see it in your media. You watch a video, a movie. You read a book about someone who experienced rape on a college campus, someone who experienced sexual abuse by someone who's in their family, by someone who's close to them. These narratives are all there. The information is all there. In the Hasidic world, you have to work hard to get it. And often the first time people are encountering this information is when such a case is happening, and they have no frame of reference to it, and all they know is that they're told to feel like they're under attack. Now, I had an unbelievable, a mind-blowing conversation with a relative of mine who I'm still reeling from the conversation. It took place over Hanukkah, and I still have not gotten over it. A friend of his was accused of sexually abusing a minor in a shul. She was in her young teens. She was sexually abused repeatedly, according to the complaint that was filed against him in civil court, by this man. He was in his 30s or 40s. He was a balkaira in the shul. And what's described is a pretty brutal regime of sexual abuse that occurred over an extended period of time. And when I was talking to him about this is a friend of his, right? So he has a negia here. So it's important to recognize that. But we were talking about it, and he said, well, what he did wasn't that serious. Yeah, she was young, but she seduced him. She went after him. Never mind that he was in his late 30s, early 40s at the time, right? She seduced him. And then he followed that up by telling me to my face, what she did to him by seducing him was worse than anything he could have done to her, right? And this is a man who is the sweetest, most wonderful person in every other area. The guy wants to see the beauty in everybody, even in Jews he fundamentally disagrees with. And then he followed it up with a real whopper. He said, I understand. According to Goyish law, yeah, he did something he shouldn't have. But al pi toida, right? That's how he actually said it. But al pi toida, she did something wrong, right? And I said to him, I looked him dead in the eye, and I said, al pi toida, there's no isser against raping children. It's not explicitly written anywhere that you can't rape a child. Obviously, there are halachic reasons that we know. It's pekuach nefesh. It's the equivalent of ritzicha, right? That's a halachic framework that we've built to explain what sexual abuse is. But there's no explicit isser against raping a child. And I said to him, but I hope you would agree with me at the very least that someone who rapes a child is a novel bereshis hatayra and doesn't belong in your shul, And that he didn't really have a risk. He was like traumatized by the fact that I had even said that to him. So that's a lot of the mentality that we're dealing with. People really don't understand the harm it causes. They don't understand that it's a prevalent problem, right? And that it happens everywhere and causes a severe amount of damage. They just don't acknowledge it.
Okay, Asha, I'm going to take that. I'm going to throw the following question out to all three of you. I don't know who would like to answer it. Please chime in as you want. My question is, in describing this, call it cognitive dissonance, call it being dan l'chaf in a very inappropriate way, judging favorably in an inappropriate way, whatever it is that's happening here, I want to know how authentic it is. What I mean by that is, let's say Nechemya Weberman is released tomorrow and he moves back into his community. Are people there going to actually be happy living next door to him if they have children? Do they actually believe that he's innocent? Or is this something which they tell themselves, but as best as we can tell, deep down, they kind of know that's not true? What is actually going on psychologically to the degree that we can guess what they're really thinking?
I don't mind taking this because I've been following this for this whole time. Okay, in magazines and newspapers that show up in every home in the Hasidic world, right? For 13 years, they've been writing that this guy is Yosef HaTzadik, without exaggeration. Not only have they been writing it, he's been writing it. Weberman himself has been writing op-eds, right? There are people right now who are having children from prison, 100%, that are being published completely uncritically, where he refers to himself as Yosef HaTzadik, falsely accused by some, whore, and his whole life is turned upside down, but he's committed to Torah and he's suffering for us, and he's going to be a schus for Klal Yisrael, right? So if you're having children right now, right, 13 years ago, right, you were old enough to start reading these newspapers, and you've been fed a steady diet of this stuff. And your friends have all been going to visit, if you're Satmar at least, your friends have been going to visit Weberman, and you've been seeing ads in every single publication. Donate commissary to Nechemya Bendina, or go visit, or say Tehillim. There were reports out of Kiryas Yisrael on the day of the hearing that they were having the kids in Kiryas Yisrael say a kapitel of Tehillim for him during the hearing, right? So your whole life, for the last 13 years, you're hearing that this guy is a tzaddik. And all the people who were older than that, right, who already had their children, maybe they have grandchildren now, or maybe they have older children now, they've spent the last 13 years reading this stuff, and in large part, they spent 13 years supporting this stuff, right? So, yeah, I know it seems crazy to just straight answer this question, yes. But yeah, 100%. I guarantee you, I'm willing to put down a lot of money right now on a bet on this, if this were Polymarket, right? In betting that the main Satmar Shul on Lee Avenue is going to have a party like you've never seen before at that shul when Weberman gets out of prison, and people are going to be jumping over themselves to sponsor a Kiddush that Shabbos, and no one is going to have a problem with living next door to him. And more alarmingly, no one's going to have a problem sending their kids to him if he decides to hang a shingle as a counselor. And the community itself has backed itself so far into a corner at this point that they can't take any other tack, because what are they supposed to do? When he gets out, what are they supposed to do? Are they going to say like, oh, well, yeah, we've spent 13 years saying this guy was falsely accused and that he's a tzaddik on par with Yosef HaTzadik, right? And the latest one is Yaakov Avinu living with Lavan, right? That's the latest one, right? They spent 13 years saying that about him, but now actually, please don't send your kids to him. People are going to ask why. They can't say that. They've created a situation where they are not able to protect any children from Weberman. And in fact, they're not able to do anything but give him anything he wants at this point.
Serena, let me ask, is there something that can be done legally to help prevent what Asher is suggesting is going to happen? Like, for example, the registry of child molesters, making sure he's nowhere near a school or nowhere near children, or even perhaps, I don't know if legally this is possible, but to dictate where he's allowed to live, where he's not allowed to live.
Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, I wanted to say I have nothing more to add to what Asher said. He covered it completely, and I completely agree with him. The only thing I'll add, just from my experience and perspective, is this is so unlike any other case, where I do think in many cases, including in our community, there will be letters sent in for somebody, and then when the person gets out, or if they get out sooner, everyone's like, okay, just we wrote that letter, but we don't actually believe it. This case is so unique, which again is why the sentence was so unique for him. That being said, with respect to protections going forward, first of all, there's an order of protection only on behalf of this one victim. So in that sense, he can't talk to her, but that's basically it. It doesn't extend to anybody else. But when he gets out, he will be subject to a SORA hearing, the Sex Offender Registry Act hearing. And in that hearing, that is where a judge determines the level of sex offender he is and what kind of restrictions will be placed on him. Now, here's the rub. He may not calculate out, based on this case, to be the highest level offender. And that is also what is so problematic about this. So I'll give you an example. There are the way that sex offender registry is calculated is twofold. Number one, they calculate different categories of what happened and certain characteristics of a person. And it's literally a mathematical equation. And if you land within X range, you either are a level 1, 2, or 3, 3 being the worst. And then there's an opportunity for the prosecution and the defense to argue for either an upward departure or a downward departure in level, meaning somebody could argue that the risk assessment instrument, which is the instrument that is used to determine mathematically what level they are, does not take certain aspects into account, and therefore this person should be increased or decreased a level. Now, what are some of the things that risk assessment instrument takes into account? Number of victims. Okay, that's number one. Number of victims, they're going to argue is only one, even though we all know there are more than one.
And that's based on how many people came forward, unlike the sentencing, in other words.
Based on the conviction. Now, there is an opportunity potentially for the prosecution to say, but, by preponderance of the evidence, we have more information about other people. But typically a judge will stick with whatever the indictment was for. Okay, whether there's proof of like alcohol or drug abuse, that was proven like in the case. I don't think we're going to have that. Whether he has prior convictions, he doesn't have that. Whether he has community support, that irony, right? That's the irony. That's going to keep him lower, not raise him higher.
They want him back.
They want him back, but the point is this community is embracing him in a way where they're not saying, hey, you did something wrong and we're going to help you reform yourself. They are encouraging the behavior. So again, that's why I said earlier, normally, this is such a messed up case that normally in the judicial system, community support acts as a rehabilitative tool. Whereas in this case, and I seriously cannot think of other cases that are as dire as this, the community is acting as a motivator to him to continue his bad behavior. So ironically, the risk assessment instrument is going to give him credit for having a community to come home to that is supportive. Okay, so he's not going to calculate out necessarily to a high level sex offender. And so therefore the restrictions that are going to be placed upon him may not really be what we believe is enough to protect other people from this man.
Serena, let me ask you another question, because I'm wondering, when you spoke before about the reduction of his sentence, one of the reasons potentially being remorse, you said that was one of the three things that was presented. So we know, based on what Asher said before, he's clearly not remorseful. But in theory, I'm curious about this concept of remorse when it comes to sex offenders, because generally the attitude of many prosecutors, and I understand where this comes from, is if you're a sex offender, basically lock them up and check out the key. I don't care if you're remorseful, because they tend to be recidivist. They're going to do it again. So I'm curious, in your experience as a prosecutor and as an attorney in general, how much should remorse count when trying to reduce somebody's sentence when it comes to sex offenders? Is that actually something which should be taken under consideration, or should we ignore it? You can be as remorseful as you want, but we're afraid you're going to do it again.
Right. There is a huge, there are huge studies that have been done about recidivism in sex offenders. And there are, from my perspective, and I'd like to hear others as well, because I'm coming at it from the legal position, but there are studies that say there are some types of people who can be rehabilitated. That is also taken into account in these SORA hearings. And so it's not necessarily the case across the board that prosecutors believe that once you do it once, it's a done deal. That being said, that's not what happened here. Clearly, this is somebody who cannot be rehabilitated. But remorse and rehabilitation kind of worked hand in hand in their argument. So it's not just the I'm sorry. It was I'm sorry, and I'm also rehabilitated through the judicial system. I've been to prison now for 13 years. For example, I actually have had clients, not in this category necessarily, but who have gone to prison and really did come out better. Doesn't happen a lot, and it does not happen a lot in my experience, but it can happen if the person has the right attitude and supports. And what you can do in prison, includes taking different programs, really, going to a psychologist, getting therapy, maybe even just learning your lesson from how terrible prison is. There's a lot of things that happen in prison that if you have the right attitude, or you're just the right combination of person, you can be rehabilitated. And remorse is one sign of the rehabilitation. So that's more of the factor of the remorse. And his rehabilitation is clearly non-existent, not only because, he's been appealing it for 13 years. And I know defendants have the right to appeal, but typically defendants who appeal and claim in their appeal, there's a lot of ways to appeal. You could list a lot of different things: ineffective assistance of counsel, maybe I did this crime, but not that crime. He claimed innocence throughout those appeals, actual innocence. And so to claim actual innocence for 13 years and then claim that he took responsibility, because that's what the defense brief said, that he took responsibility, that is completely contradictory, and it does not make sense. And then the cherry on top of the cake is the day of the actual resentencing. The fact that he showed up the way he did, with clearly zero remorse, allergic to answering any questions, allergic to admitting guilt. He read from a prepared statement, and then as soon as he was off of that and asked anything, he basically denied what he was convicted of. And so he really was clearly unremorseful.
Shauna, can you talk a little bit about the issue of rehabilitation, remorse, and recidivism in your experience? What have you seen? How likely is it, and how unlikely is it?
And in general, recidivism rates are unfortunately quite high when it comes to sexual offenses. That's just, according to the research and statistics that we know. I will say, because I always feel like this is important to say, if I have the opportunity, in case anyone's listening to this, that this might be relevant for, that when it comes to minors who have sexually offended or acted out, the recidivism rates are much, much lower, meaning if they receive proper professional counseling and therapy, then the recidivism rates are much, much lower. So I always strongly, strongly, strongly urge anyone who knows about someone who has started engaging in these kind of behaviors and offending to get them help as soon as possible, because you very well could absolutely save their lives, and of course the lives of all the people that this person could go on then subsequently to abuse. But unfortunately, the rehabilitation is not. The odds are not great when it comes to an adult, but certainly, as Serena said, when we're talking about this degree of a lack of remorse, there's not even anything to talk about or consider. There's no reason to consider that he's been rehabilitated when it is patently obvious, because he's saying it, that he has no interest in being rehabilitated because he doesn't believe he's done anything wrong. So, and that isn't just a matter of like, oh, I'm just saying it for the courts. This is the behavior and the pattern of somebody who has convinced themselves and deeply believes that they have not done that they're fine. They're fine. They don't have to fix anything. He believes that this was a tremendous injustice that was done to him. Obviously, he knows what he did, but he has justified and in whatever ways that he's done that, but he's not looking to be rehabilitated. He's not looking to change this. And the environment around him, the community, as we've talked about, is not calling him to account in any way, shape, or form. Nobody's holding him responsible. So he's not holding himself responsible. Nobody outside of him is holding him responsible. There's no reason to even think or consider that he's been rehabilitated.
All right. I'm going to ask the terrible question right now. And the reason that it's the terrible question is because it's the question that we're not allowed to ask. There's probably somebody who's listening who says, maybe he is innocent. Maybe he's been railroaded. If someone were to say that to you, I'll start with you, Serena, how would you answer? How do we know he actually is guilty and that his lack of remorse isn't coming from a place of he really didn't do anything?
Well, the lawyer in me says a jury found him guilty after a fair trial, and I would love to just be professional like that. But the human emotional person would say it's literally not possible if you have met even just the one victim that I represented and then watched him on screen and met him that way as well. It is actually not possible to think that he is innocent. It's not possible.
Okay. Asher, I see you're nodding your head as well.
Yeah, I mean that's the answer. I mean, I was sitting in the hearing. I was 10 minutes late. There was a traffic snafu, but I was sitting in the hearing during from the portion of the questioning afterwards, right after he read his statement, and I saw a video later of the statement he read from one of the reporters. He was contemptuous of the process. Like, this was a man who walked into. I'm sorry, I have to lay this out. Okay. The fix was in from the beginning. Okay. The DA had never done this before for a registered sex offender. He has, I'm going to give him credit for this, right? Because, like, to a certain extent, I agree with this program, right? Like, he has gone through certain people who received really disproportionate sentencing, or people who have really turned over a new leaf in prison, and he's advocated for their commutation, or he's worked with them in some other way to get them out of prison early. He has never done it for a sex offender, and the first one he chose was Weberman. And the reason why, and I don't have to speculate about this, because Satmar itself was putting out pictures of this, very proudly bragging about it, that their Askanim were meeting with him a whole bunch of times, right, during the summer, a couple of weeks ago, at various points in between. They hold these connections up. The Askanim in that community hold these connections up so that everybody in the community can see it, so that the average people in the community can feel powerful, and that victims in the community can feel powerless, right? And Eric Gonzalez, he recently won his re-election for the DA position, unopposed, right? So he didn't need any money or votes to get that to happen. He would have become the DA anyway. But as has been reported in the media pretty widely, especially lately, now that it's coming down to the wire, he's trying to be the pick for lieutenant governor when Hochul runs for re-election later this year, right? So he has ambition for higher office, and if he doesn't get that, he might. There's an open seat for Congress that he might run for in the district, and it's very well known in political circles in New York. And Satmar makes this known. Like, they don't make a secret of it. They promise money and votes, right, to block votes to any candidate that supports their specific interests. And sometimes that's, not fighting for yeshiva education. And sometimes it's letting their Yosef Tzaddik out of prison, right? So they worked out a deal here with Gonzalez that if he frees Weberman, they'll give him anything he wants on the electoral end, right? So Weberman knew that going in here, right? He never would have filed that motion if he didn't know the DA was going to back it. And the DA gave absolutely no opposition to it whatsoever, right? So Weberman walks into this hearing thinking this is a done deal. The DA is going to let me walk. And in fact, we later found out, because of something the DA said at the hearing, that he was authorized. He said at some point, I was authorized to offer Weberman 15 years. Now, that was the DA trying to play both sides. 15 years is not the 13 years he already served, but what it is enough time that 13 years is enough to make him immediately eligible for parole. So while he wasn't necessarily going to let Weberman walk out that day, he would have walked out in a month. so Weberman's going into this hearing with that attitude, and he's told by his lawyers, no doubt, all you have to do, you have to get through this short statement. It was a couple of paragraphs, and if you get through this, like, it's smooth sailing from here. The DA, because of pressure that we put on him, a lot of advocates in New York City, not just me, not just Serena and her client, a lot of like non-Jewish city agencies got involved here to express their disgust at what was going on. And because of that pressure, the DA had to appear somewhat tough on this, tougher at least than they were no doubt planning to be. And after Weberman's statement, the DA got up and started asking him questions about what he specifically did. Did you touch her here? Did you touch her there? Did you put your this in her that over there? You know, and he was smirking and contemptuous. He was acting like the very fact that they were asking him these questions was beneath him to answer. And at some point, actually, he denied one of the things that he was convicted of doing. And one of his kids in the crowd yelled, Baruch Hashem. And then after his lawyer put him on mute and gave him, you know, a come to Jesus moment, he came back, said, yes, okay, I did it, right? And then the DA asked another question, and that was immediately out the window. We were back to smirking and denying, and the judge even yelled at him at some point. And at that point, the DA couldn't plausibly face the rest of us and say, like, oh, well, I'm letting him out now, right? So he had to withdraw the recommendation. I think that's important context here, that Weberman felt safe in this hearing. He felt that it was his hearing, and he thought he was either walking out of there that day or that month.
And Serena, in your experience and from what you experienced, do you concur with what Asher's saying?
100%. And 15 years is basically time served. With good time, 13 years is essentially 15. So it is basically letting him walk out.
I'll just point out that about a month ago, I released an episode talking about some of the glorification of criminals in the Orthodox world. I spoke specifically about Rubashkin and Pollard with Rabbi Jeremy Weider, and immediately afterwards, Asher sent me a private message saying, just wait, Weberman's going to get out. And I was like, yeah, right. And I wrote to him, I think 2 days ago, and said, I cannot believe you're right. And he said, I'm really tired of being right. But unfortunately, that's where we are right now. Okay, we're coming close to the end of our conversation today. I'd like to ask you, Shauna, what would you suggest for Orthodox communities to do when a known abuser returns and re-enters communal life? Yes, we're talking about Weberman and the fact that his community is welcoming him. Let's say it's a community that isn't quite so welcoming. What would you recommend to parents who are in that community, or even those perhaps in the Satmar community who are more skeptical than the norm? What should they do to protect their kids?
So I think there's really two different questions there, because there's what in each individual family or parent can do to protect their own children. And then there's what we can and should be doing as adult community members to make sure that our communities are safer for all children, not only our own children. Because of course, we could all take various steps to protect our own children. We can make sure that our children know this particular individual is not somebody that's safe to be around children, that they should be spending time with that person, that they shouldn't go to that person's house, that whatever it might be. But that's not going to make the community at large any safer. As communities, we need to draw lines. Yes, people are allowed to live their lives, and that includes convicted sex offenders. They do not need to be spending time with children. They most certainly do not need to be working with children. They do not need to be volunteering with children. They do not. Every single time somebody comes to me and starts with but their parnasa, we got to get them back a job. They can teach in a school. They can, if you're really so worried about their parnasa, there are an awful lot of jobs that you can help them train for where they're going to make way more money than they're going to make in anything related to working with children. Let's be honest. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that somebody that is absolutely outrageous. Just for in so many different areas, there just need to be lines drawn. This isn't somebody that needs to be dominating in a minyan. Certainly, if there happens to be a minyan in that community where there's no children, where there's, I don't know, an old age home, and they're okay to have him, fine. I don't have an issue on principle with that. If nobody is going to be in danger, but this is not somebody that needs to be a part of communal life in a way that is going to expose children to being around them. They can daven at home. They can live their lives in the way they need to their lives. I was involved with a community once where the community took it upon themselves. There were a few families or older couples that did not have children that said, okay, we will spend some time with this man so that he's not completely socially isolated, so that he does not spend time with any of the families with children, which of course in a Haredi community it's difficult to find a family that doesn't have children in the home. So this was something that they really like took on, and I don't think they were happy about it, but it was actually, they felt their way to kind of do their part to make sure that the community would be a little bit safer. This is somebody that shouldn't be going to the mikvah. This is somebody that shouldn't be, I mean, they're just, the lines have to be drawn in every area of communal life. So that's not saying no, they are, can't live. They will live, and they have a right to live. That is something that, as humans, they can. I am also not a proponent of running them out of town. I think that's incredibly small-minded, because ultimately they're going to go to another community, and chances are it'll be a community that doesn't know who they are and that will be even more at risk. So I can understand that people feel like, okay, we don't want him in our backyard. We'd rather him be someone else's problem, but that's not really necessarily making anyone safer either. Communities can draw lines. Sometimes it's not so comfy. Sometimes it's a little awkward. Sometimes it involves having to have tough conversations with community leadership. That is what needs to happen.
Thank you, Shauna. Asher, I want to ask you, and this is going back really to the beginning, but it's important to discuss this at least briefly as we conclude. For parents who are listening right now, what warning signs should they take seriously? What should they be looking for when they're afraid that their children might be in trouble?
So signs of abuse, there could be things like changes in behavior and demeanor in children. There could be developmental regressions depending on how old the kid is. Something like if a kid has been, potty trained for years and has not wet the bed for years, and they start to, right, then something could be going wrong. If they start, if they're a good performer in school and suddenly they're unable to perform in school, right, a significant change like that could be caused by a number of different things, but it could also be caused by sexual abuse. And that's not to say that I don't want people to look at these things and be like, oh, that automatically means my child has been sexually abused. I think the solution here in general, as always, has to be a systemic approach where there's a dialogue that's fostered between parents and children, where the kids know that if they encounter a situation or a person that makes them unsafe, they can go to their parents and talk to them about it, and they'll be believed and taken seriously, that they could set boundaries, and exercise their body autonomy, and that those will be taken seriously, and that if they disclose something, that the people around them will take it seriously. Now, if you live in a community where that's not the case, like, my top level advice is to move. There are communities that take it more seriously than others. I understand that's not always possible, right? I have this conversation with people often about what to do. In fact, a very common conversation I have is someone will call me up, a parent will call me up, and they'll say, my kid is in the yeshiva and there's a Rebbe that's acting funny. My kid has not told me that he's been abused, but the Rebbe's acting funny. He's massaging the kids' backs. He's touching them on their stomachs. He's something, right? He's making sexual jokes. He showed one of them porn. The school doesn't want to do anything about it, and I have no power to do anything about it either. For whatever reason, there's a bunch of reasons why. Sometimes these people are involved in divorces, and the simple act of changing school involves a year of fighting in court. Like in some of these cases, they really, really cannot do anything. Certainly not move. And my answer always is like, okay, make sure that your family knows this stuff. Go out, get a curriculum. There are some really good ones out there. There's some From Darkness to Light. There's Magenu. There are some other ones, right, like that you could go out and get. And these are supposed to be taught in schools. And there's a reason for that. But if it's not being taught in schools, teach it to your kids. Open these conversations. Keep these lines of communications open. Keep an eye on them. Take them seriously when they tell you something. And if they disclose something to you, take that seriously. And another thing I tell people is that if you're involved in institutions that fundamentally don't care about this sort of thing, right? This is not advice for people who live in communities that are a little more normal about this. But if you live in a community where the institutions don't take this seriously, I always tell parents, if you can't get a group of parents that's large enough together to sort of present a united front to the school and say, we need to bring this training into schools, we need to bring experts into school to do this training for us, then what you need to do is make it clear to the administration in the school that your kid's not one of them to be messed with, and that if anything happens to your kid, you're going to go to the police and you're going to file lawsuits if that's what's appropriate. And what I always tell parents is when you're checking out a new school, right, ask to talk to the administrators and ask them what their child abuse prevention policy is, even though you know full well that they don't have one. Ask them what their policies are, right? And then go to the teachers and ask them, what do you do if a kid tells you that they were sexually abused, and listen to what they say. Now, you're going to get all the wrong answers anyway, But at the next meeting, they're all going to talk to each other, and they're going to be like, "Did you hear this crazy question I got from this mother?" And then, if God forbid something happens, or if there's any shemets of a possibility, right, that something's happening, they're not going to take a chance with your kid. Now, that doesn't help everybody, but that's advice I give to people who don't have the option to move. There are some communities that are fundamentally dangerous because they fundamentally don't take child protection seriously. And Satmar is one of them. And I understand that there are people who can't leave, but like at the top level, that's always my advice, is go find a community that is safe. And if you can't, I have some b'diavad things that you can maybe do to keep yourself safe.
Okay, thank you, Asher. As my final question, I'm going to address it to all three of you. We'll start with Asher, then to Shana, and then to Serena. If the case with Weberman forces the Orthodox world to ask itself one hard question, very briefly, what would you suggest that question be? Asher?
The hell is wrong with all of you? Like, I'm sorry to be that blunt about it, but like this isn't, a high-minded question, right? This is the basics. This is a man who was a danger for a long time, who the community knew was a danger, who the community has paid out millions of dollars for, and still tried to get out of prison. So like some communities, this question that you're asking me of like, what's one question that you would ask? The only question I could ask is what the hell is wrong with you? Now, if you're asking me about other communities where the conversation is ongoing, where there's what to talk about, and there's a minion in Sedaim, so to speak, then I would say like, look, this is what happens. This is the extreme of what happens when you don't take this issue seriously. But we don't have to be like this. Like, we can make a community that's safe. What can we do? Honestly, what can we as a community do to make sure that our kids are safe from abuse, and that if, God forbid, something does happen, because abuse comes everywhere, even in the safest places, there are abusers who prey on children. You can reduce it, but it's never going to go down to zero. In those situations, what can we do to support the victims? How can we make our approach to this whole issue victim-centric, instead of focusing on the abuser and their well-being and their parnasa and what's going to be with their family? But how can we make it victim-centric, to think about the children before they become victims, to make sure that never happens? And if, God forbid, they do, what can we do to help them and make sure that they're taken care of? And I think any community that's asking them that question honestly and earnestly is going to be one that, by definition, is safer.
Okay, thank you. Shana, what question would you have us ask ourselves?
I think that I would have two parts of the question. The first is, I want to acknowledge that it's probably very easy for many of the people, or people from many communities that would be listening to this, that are perhaps not quite as extreme, for lack of a better word, as Satmar, to think, okay, well, that's insane, but that we wouldn't do that. Like, that's just so far off the reservation that this doesn't even relate to me. And I would really challenge anyone who's thinking that to consider, okay, maybe not every single piece of what happened here. Maybe, all the hell that they heaped on this victim. Maybe not every single piece of that. Yes, it's hard for me to imagine that it's hard for me to imagine that in your average modern Orthodox shul, the rabbi getting up and calling the victim a whore. I don't think that would, is so likely to happen quite in that extreme way. But there's an awful lot of things that are not too far from that are very much still going on in the communities that I think most of the people listening to this would consider very quote unquote normal. I mean, Asher mentioned the case that's going on in Passaic right now. That is not a Satmar community, not even close. That is a community of what we would probably call, I don't know, modern yeshivish. I don't know if that's maybe quite right. And what has gone on there, if you want to really get sick for a few minutes, go through the fundraiser. Just read through the names. A lot of people, I think, went back afterwards and made their donation anonymous, because then they started getting a little bit embarrassed and realized how many people were actually looking at this. There are tens of people donating huge sums of money to defend someone accused of some of the most horrific crimes against the child that you can imagine. And again, this is not Satmar. This is very much still going on. And even if it's not going on in the same kind of way, or it looks a little bit different, it is going on. And I would challenge everyone to really think about where it's going on in their community, where it has gone on, where it is going on, and to stand up and say something about that. Furthermore, I would say that we need to all collectively think about what are the red lines that what do we consider to be red lines when it comes to, just in Jewish communities in a very large, broad sense. What do I mean by that? I think we all know that there's nothing that would prevent Mishpacha magazine or Ami magazine from putting the Satmar Rebbe on the cover tomorrow. He might be, I don't know. I don't read Mishpacha anymore. But this is, what are the red lines? What are the things that we consider? If the Satmar Rebbe or any Rebbe threw a Sefer Torah on the floor, I think Mishpacha and Ami magazine, no magazine would be showing, nobody would be showing him anymore. If he told his entire community, we don't have to wear yarmulkes anymore, no one would be putting it on the cover anymore. But somehow he has done what he's done, and the community has done that, and it's still considered, we just don't talk about that. No, we're not. We think it's a little crazy, but we still would consider him a tzaddik, and we consider the community people who are pious people. And, basically we have decided as a community that that's not a red line for us. This kind of behavior is not a red line. We will still consider these people as part of our camp, at least in the broad sense. And that needs to shift. We need to really be looking at what our priorities are, because we're sending a message, whether implicit or explicit, of what our priorities are, and it's not pretty.
Okay, thank you. Let's conclude with you, Serena.
Sure. I would have a question for anybody or any community that's supporting Weberman or the like. My question for them that they should ask themselves is, how would you feel if it was your daughter? And do you have the resources to help her advocate for herself if it does happen to her? And after you have supported the type of person who would do that kind of thing, how are you going to feel about your parenting? And then for the communities who are listening, who Shauna kind of said is like, well, we're not Satmars, so this doesn't happen here. We would never go that extreme. My question for them that they should probably ask themselves is, do your children trust that you would support them if they disclosed something happened to them, to you? And that's not a criticism, actually. That's more advice, because I think it's extremely important. And I'm speaking from my experience as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, where we see very, very delayed outcries, delayed disclosures to either, family members, counselors, police, because the child is so afraid of the consequences. And that happens even in loving families. And so I think, people might think to themselves, that's going too far. I don't want to plant the seed into my child's head. You don't have to be so explicit about it, but are you developing a family and an environment in your home where your child feels safe and secure to be able to tell you if something terrible happens to them?
Before we close, I want to let you know about a bonus conversation available exclusively to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. In the main episode, Asher referenced a disturbing case in Passaic involving a man charged with sexually abusing 3 children and the community response that followed. For our paid subscribers, I asked Asher to go much deeper into that case. We talk about what happened in the courtroom, why prosecutors were alarmed by the level of communal support for the accused, and what it means when families openly discuss pressuring victims into silence. We also explore why cases like this almost never reach prosecutors in Orthodox communities, and what that says about who feels protected and who does not. If you want to better understand how these patterns repeat themselves and why they matter far beyond any single case, that bonus conversation is available now for paid subscribers. You can find a link to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary in the show notes. I have to say, this conversation in some ways was terrible, but it's very, very important. And I'm very appreciative to the 3 of you for joining me today and helping us work this out. Shauna Aronson, Asher Lowy, and Serena Townsend, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.